The lawyer slammed the documents onto the table so hard the inkwell shattered. "Sign it," Victor Hartwell said, his voice the kind of quiet that precedes violence. "Sign it, or I will have you declared mentally unfit by Friday, and every cent your father left you will belong to me before the ink dries on his grave marker." Adeline did not flinch, but her hands, hidden beneath the table, were shaking. Her uncle smiled, the smile of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered, and slid a marriage contract across the polished mahogany toward her. The groom's name was already printed. A business associate, 51 years old, a man who owed Victor everything. "You have until morning," Victor said, straightening his cuffs. "After that, the choice is no longer yours." If you've ever watched someone try to steal everything from a woman who refused to break, subscribe right now and hit that bell, because this story is going to take you somewhere you won't expect. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Wyoming. Elias Voss read it twice at the kitchen table, once in the gray light before sunrise, and once again after Lottie had fallen asleep, because he needed to be sure he had understood it correctly. The agency in Denver confirmed it. A woman named Adeline Hartwell, age 28, had accepted his terms. She would arrive by train on the 14th of December. He folded the letter and set it beside his coffee cup and sat there for a long time without moving. He had not planned to do this. The advertisement had been his neighbor Margaret's idea, scrawled on the back of an old seed catalog and pressed into his hand one Sunday afternoon with the kind of directness only Margaret ever managed. "You need help, Elias. Lottie needs a mother. Stop being proud about it." He had thrown the catalog away. Then he had pulled it back out of the stove just before it caught. That was 8 months ago. Now there was a woman on her way to his ranch, and he had no idea what to do with that fact. He was 37 years old, and he had not been good at softness since Clara died. 3 years of raising Lottie alone had made him efficient and quiet and capable, and none of those things were the same as warm. The ranch ran because he made it run. The cattle survived because he worked hours that would have broken a younger man. Lottie ate and slept and went to bed every night with her hair braided. Badly braided, but braided, because he had taught himself how to do it by practicing on a fence post with strips of leather until his fingers finally remembered the pattern. He was a man who learned what he had to learn. He did not pretend it came naturally. The morning of December 14th was brutal. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the platform at Cavalry Creek Station was a strip of frozen wood above frozen ground, and the wind came down from the mountains with the kind of intention that made you understand why some homesteaders had simply walked away from Wyoming and never looked back. Elias stood with his hat pulled low and his coat collar turned up, and Lottie pressed against his side with her mittened hand inside his, and he watched the eastern horizon for the smoke of the train. "Is she going to be nice?" Lottie asked. She was 6 years old and asked every question she had directly, without introduction. "I don't know," Elias said. "Is she going to be pretty?" "That's not what matters." Lottie thought about this. "What does matter?" He looked down at her. Her nose was red from the cold and her dark eyes were serious in the way they always got when she was working something out. She looked like Clara around the eyes. She always had. "Whether she's kind," he said. "Whether she's strong enough to last out here. That's what matters." Lottie nodded slowly, as if filing this information somewhere she intended to retrieve it later. The train was 40 minutes late. Elias did not move from the platform. He stood with his back straight and his hands still, and he waited the way he had learned to wait on this land, without expectation, without complaint, with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped asking the world to cooperate. When the engine finally appeared and the brakes began their long metal shriek and the steam rolled across the platform in a white cloud, Elias counted the cars and watched the doors. He was looking for someone plain, someone practical. The advertisement had asked for a woman with frontier experience, willing to work, no delicate constitutions. He had been as honest as he knew how to be. He was not prepared for what stepped off the train. She came down the iron steps with one hand on the rail and one holding the brim of her hat against the wind, and the first thing Elias registered was that her dress was wrong. Not wrong the way a mistake is wrong. Wrong the way a painting is wrong when you hang it in a barn. It was deep charcoal wool, tailored at the waist, with small pearl buttons down the front that caught the pale winter light. It was the dress of a woman who had never once worried about what it would look like covered in mud. She looked up from the steps and found him immediately, as if she had already known which man he would be, and she walked toward him with a composure that made the cold air around her seem almost irrelevant. "Mr. Voss," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were gray-green and they looked directly at him, not past him, not at the ground. "I'm Adeline Hartwell." "Ma'am," he said. They shook hands. Her grip was firmer than he expected. The silence after that was approximately 3 seconds long, which felt considerably longer. "You're not what I pictured," he said. He had not intended to say it. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a flinch, not quite amusement, somewhere in between. "No," she said, "I suspect I'm not." He wanted to ask what she meant by that. He didn't. "We need to collect your things before the cold gets worse," he said instead, and turned toward the luggage car. He almost walked into the trunk. It took 4 railroad men to move it. Iron-bound, dark wood, roughly 4 feet long and half as tall, with a padlock the size of a man's fist through a hasp that looked like it had been designed to outlast the box itself. Elias stood and looked at it for a moment without speaking. Then he looked at Adeline. "That's mine," she said simply. "I can see that." He paused. "What's in it?" "Personal belongings." "Personal belongings," he repeated. "Yes." He looked at the trunk again. He thought about the wagon, and the road back to the ranch, and the weather that was coming in from the north. The trunk probably weighed close to 200 pounds. Moving it onto the wagon would take both of them, and possibly some creative engineering, and he was going to have to balance the load carefully, or the rear axle was going to have opinions about the situation. "All right," he said finally. He did not ask again. The drive back to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and the silence between them was the functional kind at first. They were both watching the road, and the wind was loud enough that conversation required effort. But somewhere past the halfway mark, Lottie gave up on being reserved and simply turned around to look at Adeline directly. "Your trunk is very big," Lottie announced. "It is," Adeline agreed. She sounded almost like she was trying not to smile. "What's inside?" "Lottie," Elias said. "It's all right." Adeline looked at the girl steadily. "It has some things that belong to my mother, and some papers, and a few things I might need." "What kind of things you might need?" "Practical things," Adeline said. "Things that help when something goes wrong." Lottie considered this. "Papa has a lot of things like that too," she said. "He has 3 different kinds of rope." "That's very wise," Adeline said. "Rope is almost always useful." Elias said nothing, but he noticed. The ranch looked smaller in winter. It always did. The cold compressed everything, pushed the horizon in, made the house and the barn and the 2 outbuildings look like things hunkered down against the weather rather than built to last. He watched Adeline take it in as they came up the drive, and he watched her face carefully, because this was the moment most women in any story like this one either squared their shoulders or went quiet in the wrong way. She went quiet. He couldn't read which way. "It's not much," he said. "I know that." "It's real," she said. "That's something." He didn't know what to make of that either. Inside the house, he showed her the kitchen and the bedroom. His room was at the back. Her room was the smaller one beside Lottie's, with the window that looked east toward the mountains. And he explained what he needed from her without dressing it up. Morning chores started at 5. Breakfast needed to be done before 6 so he could be in the fields. Lottie needed watching and schooling in the afternoons. The livestock needed tending in the evenings if the hands were occupied. It was not a short list. He delivered it the way he delivered most things, straight, without apology, without decoration. Adeline listened without writing anything down or asking him to repeat himself. "All right," she said when he finished. "You can tell me if that's too much," he said. "Better to know now." She looked at him for a moment, the same direct look she had used at the station. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I came a long way to be here. I'm not going to ask you to lower your expectations in the first hour." He almost said, "We'll see." He stopped himself. Dinner that night was beans and cornbread that Elias had prepared badly, which was also how he had prepared it every other night for 3 years. And Adeline ate it without comment and helped Lottie with her portion and asked the girl questions about her day in a way that made the conversation move forward instead of stalling, which was something Elias had never fully managed. Lottie could talk at length about almost anything, but she needed a certain kind of listening to do it, the kind that actually responded. And Elias had always been better at the listening part than the responding. Adeline was good at both. He watched them across the table and felt something he could not immediately name. Not suspicion, exactly. Not relief. Something between the two, something cautious. After Lottie was in bed, he sat across from Adeline at the kitchen table with coffee between them and the fire burning down, and he said the thing he had been holding since the train station. "Where'd you come from, Russ?" he said. "Before? Not the city you wrote in the letter. Where are you actually from?" She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Chicago," she said. "I grew up in Chicago." "What kind of family?" A pause. "Not long, but there." "The kind that had more than it needed," she said. "And the kind that argues about who gets what once it's gone." He let that sit. "Is someone looking for you?" he asked. Her eyes came up to his. "Why do you ask that?" "Because women who have more than they need don't generally answer advertisements in Wyoming without a good reason," he said. "And that trunk has a lock on it I've only seen on bank vaults." Adeline set her cup down slowly. She looked at the table for a moment, then back at him. When she spoke, her voice was careful. Not evasive, but precise, the way a person speaks when they are measuring exactly how much truth to give at a time. "I needed to be somewhere no one would think to look," she said. "That's honest. I'm not going to lie to you about that." "Are you in danger?" "Not immediately." She paused. "But there are people in Chicago who would prefer I come home." "What happens if you go home?" Her jaw tightened just for a second. "I lose everything my father spent his life building." Elias looked at her across the table for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls and the house held against it the way it always did. Not gracefully, but stubbornly. "I asked the agency for someone strong," he said finally. "They sent you." "Is that a problem?" she said. He picked up his coffee cup. "Jury's still out," he said. "But you're here. And you were good with Lottie tonight, and you didn't complain about the beans, which were not good beans." Something in her face shifted, and for just a moment she looked almost like she might laugh. "They were not," she agreed. "I'll need to trust you eventually," he said, "if this is going to work. I know that. I'm not asking for your whole story tonight. I know that too." He nodded once. "Then get some sleep. 5 o'clock comes early." She stood, picked up her coffee cup, and carried it to the basin. At the doorway, she paused. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Elias," he said. "If you're going to be here, use my name." She turned slightly. "Elias." It was the first time she had said it, and she said it like she was testing whether it fit. "Thank you for not pressing." "Tonight," he said. "I'm not pressing tonight." She almost smiled. "Tonight," she agreed. After she was gone, Elias sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, with the fire burning down to coals and the wind outside doing what the wind in Wyoming always did in December, which was remind you that it had been here long before you and intended to outlast you comfortably. He thought about the trunk. He thought about the lock. He thought about the way she had said, "I lose everything my father spent his life building. Not I lose everything I own, not I lose my money, but everything my father spent his life building," which was a different kind of sentence and meant something different about who she was. He thought about Lottie asking if she was going to be nice. He blew out the lamp and went to bed. He did not sleep right away. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and admitted to himself quietly, the way a man admits things when there is no one to hear it, that the woman in the next room was not what he had expected, and that he did not yet know if that was good or whether it was going to be the kind of trouble that came slow and hit hard. He supposed he would find out. The ranch would make that determination for him. It always did. It had a way of finding the truth in things. The first week was the kind of hard that doesn't announce itself. It didn't come as one large dramatic failure. It came as 100 small ones stacked on top of each other before breakfast. The wood stove in the kitchen had a temperament that Elias had long since made his peace with, a particular sequence of venting and feeding that kept it from either dying out or throwing smoke back into the room. And he had not thought to explain it because it had become as automatic to him as breathing. Adeline discovered this on her own at 4:50 in the morning on her second day, when the kitchen filled with a gray haze that sent Lottie into a coughing fit from 2 rooms away, and brought Elias out of his bedroom in his boots and long underwear with his eyes narrow and his jaw set, expecting something worse than it was. He fixed the stove in under a minute. He did not say anything about it. He went back to his room and finished dressing and came out to find Adeline standing at the kitchen window with her arms crossed and her back to him, and he could not see her face, but there was a particular rigidity in her shoulders that he recognized as the posture of a person deciding whether to be embarrassed or angry. "The damper needs to be pulled 3/4 before you open the feed door," he said. "Not halfway, 3/4, otherwise it backs up." "That would have been useful yesterday," she said, to the window. "I should have said it," he said. "That's on me." She turned around. Her eyes were a little red from the smoke, and there was a streak of ash on her cheekbone that she hadn't noticed yet, and for a second she looked less like a composed woman from Chicago and more like someone who had simply had a hard morning, which was a kind of honesty he hadn't expected from her. "Does it do that every winter?" she asked. "Only when the temperature drops below 15, he said, "which, out here, is about 5 months of the year." She looked at him. "Of course it is," she said with a flatness that was almost funny, and turned back to the stove. He watched her adjust the damper herself, precisely, without asking him to confirm it, and something in him relaxed slightly. Not all the way, just slightly. The neighbors arrived before the end of that first week. Wyoming in winter had a way of collapsing distance between people, not out of warmth necessarily, but out of the practical understanding that being isolated and being ignorant were 2 different things, and the second one got people killed. Margaret Aldrin came first, on a Thursday, with a jar of preserved peaches and the expression of a woman doing reconnaissance. She was 61 years old and had been on the frontier since before Elias was born, and she had very specific opinions about most things, and made no effort whatsoever to conceal them. She sat down at the kitchen table with the jar of peaches between her hands and looked at Adeline with the directness of someone who had stopped caring about politeness somewhere around her 4th decade. "You're not what I expected," Margaret said. "So I've been told," Adeline said pleasantly, and poured her coffee without spilling any, which seemed to register. "You know how to cook?" "I'm learning," Adeline said. "I made the cornbread this morning." Margaret looked at the pan on the counter. She looked at Elias. "How was it?" "Better than mine," Elias said. "That's not high praise," Margaret said, "given that his cornbread could be used for roofing material." She picked up her coffee and settled back in her chair and looked at Adeline with slightly less suspicion. "Where are you from, girl?" "Chicago," Adeline said. "Well, Lord!" Margaret set her cup down. "Who talked you into coming out here from Chicago?" "I talked myself into it." "Why?" A small pause. "I needed a change." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She was the kind of woman who could read a room the way other people read a page, quickly, and with the understanding that what wasn't written was usually more important than what was. She looked at the ash streak still faintly visible on Adeline's cheek, and the chapped knuckles on her hands, and the way she stood at her own kitchen counter with the posture of a woman still figuring out where she belonged in a space she'd only occupied for 5 days. Margaret said, which was not agreement and not disagreement, but something more like a judgment reserved. Caleb Rourke came the following Saturday. He arrived without warning, which was how Caleb generally arrived everywhere, on the grounds that an announced visit gave people time to prepare, and prepared people were less informative. He was 54, broad through the shoulders, with a face weathered into something that looked permanently skeptical, and he ran the neighboring spread to the east with a humorless efficiency that had made him prosperous, and had not made him many friends. Elias was in the barn when he heard the horse, and by the time he came out, Caleb was already standing in the yard looking at the house with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Heard your bride arrived," Caleb said by way of greeting. "She did," Elias said. "Heard she came in on the Denver line." "That's right." Caleb turned to look at him with the expression of a man delivering a verdict he'd already reached. Denver line brings people from back east, he said. City people. I had a city hand one time, man from St. Louis. Couldn't fix a fence without injuring himself 3 different ways. He paused. This woman ever done a day of real work in her life? She's doing it now, Elias said. That's not what I asked. It's the answer I'm giving you. Caleb looked at him for a moment, then back at the house. There's a storm coming in, Elias, not a small one. You've got enough to worry about without spending your winter teaching a city woman how to boil water. I didn't ask for your opinion on my household. No, Caleb said, but I'm giving it. Because if she falls apart come January, it's not just you that suffers. It's that little girl. He let that land, then added, I'm not trying to be hard on you. I'm telling you what I see. Elias looked at him steadily. What you see, he said, is a woman who's been here less than 2 weeks. Give her some time before you write the verdict. Caleb grunted, a sound that conveyed exactly nothing useful, and got back on his horse and rode east without going inside, which Elias counted as a mercy. He didn't tell Adeline about the conversation, but she had seen Caleb from the kitchen window, and that evening at dinner, without looking up from the pot she was stirring, she said, The man on the gray horse, he didn't come inside. No. Does he have a problem with me, or with the idea of me? Elias thought about it. The idea of you, mostly, he said. He's got a fixed picture of what a frontier woman looks like. You don't match it. And what does that picture look like? Someone who was born here, he said. Someone who never knew anything else. Someone whose hands were already rough before she arrived. Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she held up her right hand, palm toward him. The knuckles were red, and there was a small cut along the base of her thumb from the previous day's fence work. They're getting there, she said. He didn't say anything to that, but he noticed. The rumors started at the feed store in Cavalry Creek, which was where all the rumors in that part of Wyoming started, because it was the one place every man within 30 miles passed through every couple of weeks, and men with opinions and time on their hands were a reliable source of speculation. Elias heard the first one from his hand, a quiet 18-year-old named Dell, who reported it with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that delivering bad news was a service best done without commentary. They're saying she came out here running from something, Dell said, eyes on the ground. Some folks saying the law. Some folks talk because they get bored, Elias said. Yes, sir, Dell said. Also, they're saying the trunk's got money in it, stolen money. Elias set down the harness strap he was working with and looked out the barn door at the gray December sky for a moment. The trunk, he said slowly, has not been out of her room since she arrived. Yes, sir, doesn't stop the talking. He did not address it directly with Adeline that night. He was still thinking about the conversation, still deciding what he believed about what he didn't yet know, and he had a habit of not speaking until he knew what he actually meant to say. But she must have heard something of it herself, because 2 days later she came in from the morning chores and stood in the kitchen doorway still wearing her coat, and said, Someone said something to you about me. Recently, I can tell. I hear things, he said. What kind of things? He looked at her. Nothing, I believe. That's not an answer. It's the one I've got right now, he said. Unless you want to tell me something that would replace it. She met his eyes. The moment stretched, not uncomfortably, but with a weight to it, the way moments do when both people in them are deciding exactly how far to go. Then she pulled off her coat and hung it on the peg and turned to the stove. Not yet, she said quietly. All right, he said. I will, she said. When I know... She stopped. When you know what? She turned the damper 3/4, correctly, automatically now, and opened the feed door. When I know I'm staying, she said. For sure. He looked at the back of her head, at the way she held herself at the stove, the small adjustments of a woman learning a life she had not been raised to, and he thought, You're already staying, you just don't know it yet. He didn't say that either. Lottie, for her part, had conducted her own assessment of Adeline with the thoroughness of a 6-year-old who had very few illusions left. She had tested her in the ways available to a child, sitting too close, asking questions without warning, bringing her rocks and dead beetles and a drawing of a horse that didn't much resemble a horse, and watching how each of these was received. Adeline had received them all without flinching. She had admired the rocks with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, disposed of the beetle with calm practicality, and hung the horse drawing on the wall beside the window, which Lottie had noticed and said nothing about, but kept looking at. It was the doll that changed things. It happened on a Thursday night, 3 weeks after Adeline's arrival, when the temperature outside had fallen to something that turned the water in the yard to iron and made the house creak and settle like a ship in weather. Elias was at the table going over his ledger. The numbers were bad and getting worse, which was their natural state in winter and always had been. When he heard Lottie start to cry in the way that she almost never cried, not the performative tears of a child who wants something, but the quiet, confused grief of a child who has lost something that cannot be replaced. He was halfway to his feet when he heard Adeline's voice from the bedroom, low and steady. He stopped. "Let me see," Adeline was saying. A small silence. "Oh," Adeline said. "I see." The arm came off at the shoulder. "Mama made her," Lottie said with the careful steadiness of someone trying very hard not to fall apart. "She made the whole thing, the dress too." "She's beautiful," Adeline said. Not falsely. Not in the bright hollow tone people use with children when they're trying to manage a situation, just simply as a statement. "Can she be fixed?" Lottie's voice cracked on the last word just slightly. A pause. Elias stood in the hallway without moving. "I think so," Adeline said. "But I need something. Give me just a moment." He heard her cross the floor. He heard the sound he had not heard before, the click of a padlock opening, then the particular soft groan of old hinges that had not been used in some time. He heard her moving through the trunk, and then he heard her stop. "This," she said quietly, seemingly to herself. Then to Lottie, "Come here. Look at this thread. Do you see the color?" A small sound that might have been a yes. "This thread belonged to my mother," Adeline said. "She used to say that the right thread can hold almost anything together if you use it with enough care." Another pause. "I'm going to use it to fix your doll, if that's all right with you." Whatever Lottie said in response was too soft for Elias to hear. He went back to the kitchen. He sat down at the ledger and looked at the numbers without seeing them. He sat there for nearly an hour while the sounds from the bedroom were the small sounds of patient, careful work. And then finally, Lottie's voice saying something in a tone he had not heard from her in 3 years. A tone of uncomplicated, unguarded relief. He was still sitting there when Adeline came back to the kitchen, carrying the doll. The arm was reattached. The stitching was so fine it was nearly invisible. She set the doll gently on the table beside his ledger. "She's sleeping," Adeline said, meaning Lottie. "Thank you," Elias said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Adeline looked at the doll for a moment, then at him. "She told me a little about her mother," she said carefully. "About Clara." He nodded once. He did not trust himself to say more than that right now. "She's a good girl," Adeline said. "She is." "She's been very brave." Adeline paused. "Both of you have." He looked up at her. She wasn't being soft about it. She was saying it the way you'd say something factual, something you'd observed and concluded, and that made it harder to deflect. He had gotten used to people saying things about Clara and Lottie in a tone that required him to reassure them in return. The strange social transaction of grief where the bereaved ends up comforting the person who raised the subject. Adeline was not doing that. She was just saying what she saw. "It gets easier," he said, though he wasn't sure that was true anymore. "You just get better at carrying it." She looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes did, directly, without looking away first, which he was almost used to by now. And then she nodded, as if that answer had meant something to her. He didn't entirely understand. She was at the doorway when he said, "The trunk." She stopped. "I wasn't listening on purpose," he said. "I heard the lock." She turned slowly. Her expression was guarded, but not frightened. "I know." "You don't have to tell me what's in it," he said. but I want you to know that I saw something in there." He paused. "When they moved it off the train, the corner came up on the cloth and I caught a corner of what looked like—" He stopped, choosing the word carefully. "Documents, legal documents." Adeline was very still. "I'm not asking," he said again. "I told you I wasn't asking tonight, and I'm still not. But I want you to know I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid. And whatever you're keeping in that box—" He stopped and picked up the doll from the table and turned it in his hands, looking at the repair she'd made, at the thread that was almost invisible against the fabric. "You used your mother's thread to fix my daughter's toy," he said. "That tells me something." She was quiet for a long time. "It tells you what?" she said finally. He set the doll down. "That you're not the kind of person who takes things," he said. "Whatever else you are. Whatever else is in that trunk." She looked at him across the kitchen, across the lamp and the ledger and the bad numbers and the repaired doll, and for just a moment he could see something under the composure. Not fear, not relief exactly. Something more like the expression of a person who has been braced for a blow for so long that when it doesn't come, they don't quite know how to stand. "Elias," she said, his name, again, in that same careful way. "Get some sleep," he said. "The stove will need feeding at 4. She almost said something else. He could see it, could see her mouth start to form words and then stop. Instead, she looked at the doll one more time, and then at him, and then she went to bed. He blew out the lamp and sat in the dark with the numbers in the ledger and the wind outside and the faint smell of the coffee she'd made earlier still hanging in the room. In the corner of the kitchen, Lottie's fixed doll sat on the table with its arm whole again, and the invisible thread holding it together like something that had never broken at all. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the wind picked up. Further north, in the mountains above the valley, a pressure system that had been building for 10 days was finally beginning to move. The temperature, already punishing, was about to drop another 15 degrees. The kind of storm that didn't care what you'd built or how long you'd worked to build it. The kind that tested what was real and what was only the appearance of it. It was coming. Elias could feel it in the way the air changed. That particular dense electric stillness that preceded the worst weather, the kind that old hands on the frontier recognized the way sailors recognize the color of water before a reef. He sat in the dark and felt it arriving. And he thought about the woman in the next room, and the trunk with the lock, and the thread too fine to see, and the fact that Lottie had finally, for the first time in 3 years, gone to sleep without calling out. He thought about all of that, and he didn't know yet what it meant. But he knew, with the plain, unromantic certainty of a man who had been on this land long enough to trust what his gut told him, that whatever was coming next was going to answer a lot of questions he hadn't yet found the words to ask. The storm did not arrive with drama. That was the thing about the worst weather in Wyoming. It didn't announce itself the way storms did in stories, with lightning and a building roar. It simply arrived the way a wall arrives when you walk into a dark room. 1 hour, the sky was the low yellowish gray that Elias had been watching for 2 days. The next hour, the visibility was 30 feet and shrinking. He was already in the barn when it hit. He had moved the horses in the previous evening and stacked extra feed where he could reach it without going far, and he had told Dell to stay at the bunkhouse and not to come out for anything short of a structural fire, because Dell was 18 and from Missouri and had not yet developed the particular respect for Wyoming blizzards that kept men alive through them. The cattle were in the lower pasture, which was partially sheltered by a long ridge to the northwest, and Elias had told himself the ridge would be enough. He had told himself that the previous night, calculating. Running the numbers the way he ran all numbers on this ranch, without much margin, but with the experience of a man who had been doing it for 15 years. By 9 in the morning, standing in the barn door watching the white close in from every direction at once, he understood that he had been wrong. He could not see the lower pasture. He could not see the ridge. He could not see the fence line 30 yards out. What he could see was white, moving white, the kind that had no depth or dimension to it, and he knew from sound alone that the temperature had dropped well past what he had calculated, because the wind had changed pitch. It was no longer pushing. It was screaming, a high, thin note that meant serious cold on top of serious wind, and cattle in that pasture, even sheltered cattle, would not last the day. He went back inside to get his rope. Adeline was in the kitchen when he came through, and she read him before he said a word. That was something she had developed in the 5 weeks since her arrival. Not a supernatural ability, just the ordinary attentiveness of a woman who had been watching him closely enough to understand what his face meant when it was doing different things. Right now his face was doing the thing it did when there was a problem that had no good solution, only a least bad one. "The cattle," she said. "Lower pasture," he said. "Ridge isn't enough." "How many?" 32 head. He was already pulling rope off the wall peg. "I have to go out." She looked at the window. The glass was completely white. "Elias, I know," he said. "You can't see 20 feet." "I know that too." He began looping the rope across his shoulder, the automatic motions of a man who has done a thing so many times it bypasses thought entirely. "I'll tie off to the fence post at the barn door and follow the line to the pasture gate. From the gate, I can follow the pasture fence south to the lower shelter. Get them moving in. Close the gate." "What if you lose the fence line?" He looked at her. "I won't." "But if you do?" He didn't answer that because the answer was not one he intended to say in his own kitchen on a Wednesday morning. He tied off the end of the rope to the iron ring on the barnside wall, a ring he had put there himself 7 years ago for exactly this reason, and checked the knot twice. "Keep Lottie inside," he said. "Don't open the door for anything. If I'm not back in 2 hours—" He stopped. 2 hours, she repeated. "And then what?" "Dell's in the bunkhouse. He'll know what to do." "He's 18, she said. Her voice was level, but she was gripping the edge of the kitchen counter and he could see it. "Adeline." He said her name the way she had said his, that first night, carefully, testing the weight of it. "I have to go." She let go of the counter. She nodded once, a tight, controlled motion. "Come back," she said. Not as a plea, as an instruction. "Intend to," he said, and went out the door. The wind hit him like something physical, like a door swung open by a large man in a hurry. It was not the worst he had experienced on this land, but it was close, and the cold was extraordinary, the kind that found the gap between your collar and your hat within the first 30 seconds and went to work immediately. He kept one hand on the rope and moved along it toward the fence line, counting his steps by habit, a technique he had learned from an old hand in his first winter here who had navigated a blizzard by counting to 30 between fence posts and had lost 2 fingers to frostbite but kept his life. He found the pasture gate. He found the fence line. He began moving south. He lost the fence line 11 minutes later. He did not panic. Panic in a whiteout was a death sentence, and he knew it. And he stood still for a full 30 seconds with his hand still extended where the fence had been, moving it slowly left and right, feeling for the wire. Nothing. He took 2 steps to the left. Nothing. He took 2 steps back to the right. Nothing. The wind was so loud it was inside his skull, pressing outward, and the cold had his face now, really had it. The kind of sensation that stops being pain after a while and becomes a strange, distant numbness that is considerably more dangerous than pain. He found the fence on the 3rd sweep to the right, lower than he expected. The wind had pushed a drift against the bottom 2 wires, and what he'd been reaching for was 3 feet above the top of the remaining exposed wire. He grabbed it with both hands and felt the cold metal through his gloves like a burn, and held on, and let himself breathe. He found the cattle shelter 22 minutes after leaving the barn. It felt longer. Most things did in a whiteout, which was part of what made them dangerous. Your sense of time expanded, made you feel more lost than you were, made the distance back seem longer than the distance out. He counted 17 head already crowded against the 3-sided shelter wall, which meant 15 were somewhere else in the pasture, which meant 15 cattle in open ground in a blizzard. He spent the next 40 minutes finding them. He did not find all of them at once. He found them in 1s and 3s, herd animals gone individually stupid with panic, standing in places that made no sense relative to the shelter, facing directions that would have walked them straight into the fence or the ravine at the south end of the pasture if they had kept moving. He pushed them. He yelled into the wind until his throat hurt. He used the fence line and the rope and the sound of the other cattle as navigation, and he worked the pasture methodically, the way you work a problem when you have no good options, corner by corner, without rushing, without assuming. He got 30 head into the shelter before his horse went down. He had brought the horse because you covered ground faster, and because in a bad blizzard your horse could smell the cattle when you couldn't see them. But the horse had been nervous since they left the barn, and now, on the return pass along the south fence, it planted its front feet and refused, and when Elias pressed it forward it moved 2 steps, and then the ground simply wasn't there anymore. A small icy depression hidden under 18 inches of new snow, the kind of thing that in clear weather would have been a half-second stumble. And the horse went down sideways and rolled, and Elias went with it, and the rope came out of his hand. He did not lose consciousness. He came close. His shoulder hit the frozen ground with enough force to make his vision white in a different way than the blizzard, and the horse's weight came across his lower left leg and pinned it, and for a moment all there was in the world was cold and pain and the sound of the wind. Then there was nothing but cold, which was worse. He tried to move his leg. It moved, which meant nothing was broken, but the horse was still across it, and the horse was panicked and trying to get up and making the situation worse with every attempt. He pushed at the animal's neck, trying to get it to roll the other way, and managed to slide his leg back 6 inches, which was not enough, and tried again, and got another 4 inches. And by the 3rd attempt, his leg was out, but his boot was still pinned, and he had to leave the boot in the snow. He stood up without his left boot in a Wyoming blizzard. He looked at the horse. The horse looked at him with the whites of its eyes showing and its legs scrabbling on the ice, and Elias did a quick assessment. No obvious injury, just shock and terror, and made a decision he was not certain about. He left it. He left it because he could not get it up alone in these conditions, and standing still was going to kill him faster than moving, and the horse had more body mass and more natural insulation than he did, and its odds were better than his if he stayed. He moved. He moved because that was the only thing left to do. He had no rope, he had no fence. He had one boot and a shoulder that was making its displeasure known with every step. He had the wind, which was consistent at least in direction, and he turned his back to it because the barn was northwest and the wind was coming from the northwest. And if he walked into the wind, he was walking toward shelter. He knew this was not reliable navigation. Wind shifted. But it was what he had. He walked. He didn't know how long he walked. The boot foot was numb within the first 2 minutes, which was either a mercy or a bad sign, and he didn't have the mental energy to determine which. His shoulder throbbed in a rhythm that was almost metronomic. He kept his head down against the wind and watched the ground directly in front of him, because you could lose your footing without warning in this, and he was not willing to fall again. He was thinking about Lottie when he heard the voice, not Lottie's voice, Adeline's. He stopped. He was certain, for a moment, that he was hearing things, that the cold had gotten into the part of his brain that generated reasonable perceptions, because she was supposed to be in the house. She was supposed to be in the house with Lottie and the stove and the door closed, because that was what he had told her, and she had nodded in that precise, controlled way that he had come to understand meant she had processed an instruction and filed it, and he had thought that meant she agreed. He had misunderstood what that meant about Adeline. "Elias!" The voice again, closer, slightly left of him. "Here!" he shouted, and the wind took his voice and threw it sideways, and he shouted again louder. "Here! I'm here!" A shape materialized out of the white. She was wearing his canvas work coat over her own coat, which was too large for her by 6 inches in every direction and gave her the silhouette of someone wearing a barn. And she had a rope tied around her waist, tied, he noted in some remote observational part of his brain, with a bowline knot, which was correct. And she had the other end of the rope in her hands, and she was letting it out behind her as she moved, and she had a lantern that was somehow still lit in the wind, held low and shielded by her body. She reached him and grabbed his arm. Her grip was hard and immediate. "What are you—" he started. "Don't," she said. She was breathing hard, and her face was so cold it had gone past red into a pale, frightened white around the edges, but her eyes were entirely present, entirely focused. "Walk. Talk later." "Lottie." "Margaret came," Adeline said, already pulling him. "She came to check on us when it got bad. She's with Lottie. I tied the rope to the porch rail. Walk." He walked. She kept her hand on his arm the entire way, not guiding. He could follow the rope, but there, which was different. He could feel the pressure of it even through the coat, and the cold, and the fact that the lower half of his left leg, had largely stopped sending information. The house appeared. It appeared suddenly, the way things appeared in a whiteout, not gradually resolving but just suddenly there. The lamplight in the window going from nothing to present in the space of 2 steps, and the porch rail and the door and the rope tied to it in a neat half-hitch. He got up the steps. She got the door open. The heat from inside hit his face like something solid. Margaret was at the kitchen table with Lottie, and Lottie took one look at Elias and at his one boot and his face, and made a sound that was not quite a word, and got off her chair so fast she knocked it over, and Elias caught her with his good arm and held on. "I'm fine," he said into her hair. "I'm fine. It's all right." "Your boot is gone," Lottie said, muffled against his chest. "Papa, your boot is gone." "I know it," he said. "I know." "Are you hurt?" Margaret said, already at the stove, already putting water on. "Shoulder," he said. "And the foot's cold, but I can feel it coming back, which means it's not gone," Margaret said. She looked at Adeline over his head, a look that carried something Elias couldn't quite read from where he was standing. "Get his boot off," she told Adeline. "The wool sock, too. We need to see the foot." The next hour was unglamorous in the way that genuine emergencies always were. There was no heat near the foot. Margaret was uncompromising about that. Warming, frost-bitten tissue too fast destroyed it. She had seen it happen to a man who had been in a bigger hurry than his blood supply and had lost 3 toes for the urgency. There was a lot of room-temperature water and a lot of waiting and a significant amount of discomfort that Elias endured without making any particular fuss about, because making a fuss about it would not have helped, and Lottie was watching. Adeline sat across from him and held the basin and said almost nothing, which was exactly what he needed. At some point, Lottie fell asleep against Margaret's side, which was a testament to how exhausted the morning had made her, and Margaret put her on the couch and covered her with the quilt from the chest by the door. And then Margaret came back to the table and looked at Elias with the expression of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it. "The horse?" Elias asked, before she could start. "Dell got it," Margaret said. "Boy went out with a rope and a lead and brought it back 20 minutes ago. Fool thing was standing at the pasture gate like it couldn't figure out how to open it." She paused. "No permanent damage. Horse has more sense than its rider, apparently." Elias looked down at the basin. "She went out after you," Margaret said. It was not an accusation, it was a statement of fact delivered with the particular weight of a woman who intended it to be understood. "I can see that," Elias said. "She tied a bowline," Margaret said. Do you know how rare that is? Most men I know tie a granny knot and call it good. She tied a bowline, and she took the lantern from the kitchen hook, and she walked out into that blizzard after you." Margaret glanced at Adeline, who was looking at the basin and pretending not to be part of this conversation. "She came to my door when she knew you'd been gone too long. She said, 'Tell me the fastest way to the pasture.' She didn't ask me to go. She didn't wait for someone else to do it. She asked me the fastest route, and she tied herself off and she went." "Margaret," Adeline said quietly. "I'm telling him," Margaret said, unapologetically. "You don't need to," Adeline said. "He was there." "He was barely conscious when you found him," Margaret said. "He may not have full recall of the particulars." She turned back to Elias. "I'll say this once and then I'll leave it alone. I was wrong about her. I'm not wrong about many things, but I was wrong about that." She pushed back from the table and went to check on Lottie. The kitchen was quiet for a moment, just the fire and the storm outside and the sound of Margaret moving in the next room. Elias looked at Adeline. She was still looking at the basin. There was a bruise developing along her left cheekbone that he had not noticed earlier. She must have gone down at some point in the wind. And her hands were still slightly too pale, and she looked like someone who had used everything she had and was running now on the reserve that people only found out they had in moments that required it. "You could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she said. "It's my land. It's—" She stopped. She looked up at him. "It's where I live," she said carefully. "You're—" Another stop. Then, "It's where Lottie lives." He looked at her for a long time. His shoulder hurt. His foot hurt, although in the specific, cautiously promising way that meant the blood was coming back into it, which Margaret had said was what you wanted, and she was right, but knowing that did not make it more comfortable. He was exhausted in a way that went past the body and into somewhere else, somewhere he didn't have a precise name for. "Adeline," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a thread under it, thin, barely audible, the sound of someone who had been holding something very tightly for a long time and was close to the edge of the ability to keep holding. "Please don't thank me. Just," she pressed her lips together, "just be all right." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. He didn't say anything. He left his hand there for a moment, and her fingers under his were cold and still, and then, slowly, they turned and held on. Margaret came back into the kitchen and looked at the two of them and went directly to the stove and made an extraordinary amount of noise with the coffee pot for someone with such evident awareness of what was happening behind her. Outside, the blizzard was still going. It would go for another 8 hours. The temperature would drop further before it rose. 2 fence posts in the east pasture would need to be replaced in spring, and the south gate had been ripped clean off its lower hinge by the wind, and one of the cattle in the lower shelter had a cut on its foreleg from the wire that would need watching. But 30 cattle were in shelter. The horse was in the barn. Lottie was asleep under a quilt. Dell was in the bunkhouse, slightly frostbitten around the ears but intact. And Elias Voss was sitting at his kitchen table with his foot in a basin of cold water and his shoulder aching and his hand over the hand of the woman who had walked out into the worst storm of the year to find him, with a lantern and a rope and a bowline knot, and had done it not because she had to, and not because she had been asked, but because it was where she lived. He didn't ask her who she really was that night. The question was still there. It had never gone anywhere. But it sat differently now. It sat less like suspicion and more like something he was going to have to approach carefully, the way you approached a thing of value you didn't want to break by grabbing at it. What he did ask, much later, when Margaret had gone home and Lottie was in bed and the storm had quieted to a low, steady moan, was this: "The supplies in the trunk," he said. "The rope and the lantern, those weren't in the house." She looked up from the mug she was holding. "No," she said. "You put them in there when you arrived," he said, "before anyone knew a storm was coming." "I put them in there because I didn't know what I was coming to," she said. "I've been preparing for things to go wrong since I was old enough to understand that they could." He looked at her. "What kind of life teaches a person that at that age?" he said. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Outside, the wind moved against the house, and the house held, the way it always held. Stubbornly, without grace, by virtue of having been built for exactly this kind of resistance. "The kind I'll tell you about," she said, "when the storm's done." She looked at him over the rim of the mug, and for the first time since she had arrived on the platform at Cavalry Creek Station, she looked like someone who had stopped calculating the distance to the door. "I promise you that." He nodded. He believed her. He wasn't sure when he had started believing her, but he believed her now. And that was enough for tonight. The lamp burned low. The coffee went cold. The storm outside finally, slowly, without apology, began to exhaust itself, the way all storms eventually did. And by the time the first gray light showed in the east window, the wind had dropped to something that only sounded dangerous rather than being it, and the world outside was white and still and entirely transformed, the way it always was after something that severe, as if the land itself had been remade overnight into something you had to learn to read all over again. Elias fell asleep in the chair sometime before dawn. He didn't mean to. He woke up an hour later with a blanket over him that had not been there when he closed his eyes, and the stove fed and burning correctly, 3/4 on the damper, feed door fully open, and the smell of coffee already filling the kitchen. He sat with the blanket around his shoulders for a moment and listened to the sounds of the house settling into morning, the stove ticking, the wind at a distance now, Lottie's feet on the floor of her room, the soft, specific sounds of someone in the kitchen who had learned over the course of 5 hard weeks exactly how things needed to be done. He sat with all of that, and he thought about a woman who tied bowline knots and walked into blizzards and used her dead mother's thread to fix a broken doll, and had come to Wyoming running from something she had not yet told him, but had promised that she would. And he understood, sitting there with a borrowed blanket and a foot that still ached, and a shoulder that was going to ache longer, that he had stopped thinking of her as the woman who had arrived on the train. He had started thinking of her as someone who belonged here. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He supposed that was something else the storm would have to sort out for him, in its own time, in the way that Wyoming sorted most things. Without gentleness, without hurry, and without any particular concern for whether you were ready. She had promised him after the storm. And Adeline Hartwell was not a woman who made promises she did not intend to keep. But the days after the blizzard were consumed by the kind of work that a storm of that size generated in its wake. Fence lines to assess, animals to check, the south gate to jury-rig back into something functional before the next cold snap arrived. Elias's shoulder kept him from heavy lifting for 3 days, which he endured with poor grace, and Adeline managed by simply doing more than her share without drawing attention to the fact, which was either considerate or aggravating depending on the hour and his level of pain. Dell replaced the 2 ruined fence posts in the east pasture. The cattle in the lower shelter were counted and recounted. 32 head, all present, the cut on the foreleg healing cleanly. On the 4th day after the storm, Elias came inside at noon to find the trunk open. Not ransacked, not disturbed, open. The padlock hung on a hasp. The lid was raised. Adeline was sitting in the chair beside it with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and she looked like someone who had made a decision and was waiting for the consequences to arrive. Elias stood in the doorway and looked at the trunk, and then at her. "Lottie's at Margaret's," she said. "I asked her to take her for the afternoon." He came inside. He took off his coat and hung it on the peg and came and sat down across from her in the other chair, the one that usually lived beside the window. He didn't look at the trunk again. He looked at her. "All right," he said. She reached into the trunk and removed a document. Heavy paper, formal, with a seal at the bottom that he could see from where he sat was not a simple letterhead. She held it for a moment before she handed it to him, the way a person holds something they are not certain they can get back once they let go of it. He took it. He read it slowly, because he was a careful reader by habit. It was a legal instrument, a title document specifically, bearing the name of a company, Hartwell Continental Trading, incorporated in the state of Illinois. The document named the sole inheritor of controlling interest, Adeline M. Hartwell. He looked up. She was watching him. "My father built it from a single import contract in 1851, she said. By the time he died, it had 11 offices and contracts in 4 countries. He spent 42 years on it. She paused. He had 1 child. He left it to that child. "You," Elias said. "Me," she said. "Which my Uncle Victor found unacceptable." She reached into the trunk again. This time she came out with a letter, not formal, not sealed, handwritten on plain paper in a cramped, angular script that conveyed urgency in its very shape. She did not hand this one over. She held it and looked at it. "My father died in February," she said. "Victor arrived at the house 3 days after the funeral. He brought a lawyer. He brought a marriage contract." She stopped, and when she continued, her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone who has practiced saying a thing until the emotion is worn smooth on the surface and only the shape of it remains. "The man I was to marry was named Garrett Phelps. He was 51 years old and he had been in business with Victor for 11 years. If I married him, controlling interest in Hartwell Continental would transfer to a joint trust. Victor managed the trust. I was a signature on a document." Elias set the title instrument on his knee. "What happened when you said no?" "Victor said I was grieving and not thinking clearly." She looked at the letter. "He said he would have me evaluated, that he would bring witnesses to testify to my instability." A pause. He had witnesses. Men he had paid, men who owed him. My father's own attorney had been turned. "How long did you have?" "He gave me until the following morning," she said. "The first time." "The first time," Elias repeated. "He came back twice more. Each time the terms were worse." She folded the letter along its existing creases, the practiced fold of a document handled many times. "The third time he came, he brought Phelps with him. He brought him to my father's house, into my father's study, and sat him in my father's chair." Her jaw tightened. That was when I understood that waiting and hoping for something to change was not a strategy. "What did you do?" "I had 3 weeks before his next scheduled visit," she said. "I used them." She looked at the trunk. "I had a trusted solicitor. A man who had worked for my father for 20 years. A man Victor had not yet reached. He helped me convert the most critical assets into instruments I could carry. Title documents. Bearer bonds. Gold certificates. She paused. Physical gold in the bottom of the trunk. Not much. Enough. Elias was quiet for a moment. He thought about the weight of the trunk, about the 4 railroad men it had taken to move it. How much, he said carefully, is enough? She met his eyes. More than this ranch is worth, she said. More than this county is worth, if I am being honest with you. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a gust moved against the north wall, a leftover argument from the storm. The fire in the stove was burning correctly, damper 3/4, the way it always was now. And the company itself? Elias said. Still in Illinois, still operating. Victor is managing it, which means he is extracting from it, which means by the time I could legally contest it, there would be less to contest. She said it flatly, without self-pity, but he could hear the cost of it underneath. My solicitor filed papers before I left. A challenge to the probate, a formal contestation of Victor's authority. It will move slowly. Courts move slowly. Victor has more influence with the courts in Chicago than I have money to counter with, at least for now. She looked at the title document still sitting on his knee. What I have is evidence. What I have is documentation that my father intended the company to be mine, that his will was clear, that the subsequent instruments Victor produced were fabricated. Can you prove the fabrication? With time, and the right people, and a jurisdiction where Victor doesn't have the judge's ear. She paused, which is why Wyoming was useful to me. He looked at her. You chose Wyoming because the courts here wouldn't know Victor Hartwell. I chose Wyoming, she said, because it was the last place anyone from my world would look for a Hartwell. A beat. And because the advertisement asked for someone hardworking and willing to survive the conditions. She held his gaze. I am both of those things. Whatever else I am both of those things. That was not a deception. He looked down at the document on his knee. He thought about the beans she had eaten without complaint on her first night. He thought about the damper on the stove, 3/4, automatic now. He thought about the bowline knot. He thought about Lottie's doll. He thought about Victor Hartwell, a man he had never met, sitting in another man's chair in another man's house, and the particular category of person that action described. Is he looking for you? He said. Yes. Has he found you? A pause. A short one, but it was there. Not yet. Elias heard the yet the way you hear a sound in the dark, aware of it before you can identify it, already on your feet before you know why. What does not yet mean? He said. She reached into the trunk a third time and produced a small envelope, the kind that carried a telegraph message. She held it for a moment, and in that moment he could see something in her that he had not seen before. Not fear exactly, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that was aware of a threat and had not yet found the adequate response. She handed him the envelope. The telegraph had been sent 3 days ago, routed through the Cavalry Creek station office, addressed to A. Hartwell, care of the Voss Ranch. He had not seen it. Dell had collected the mail 2 days after the storm and left it on the kitchen table in a stack. And Adeline had apparently taken this from the stack without saying anything. He read it. It was 4 lines. It said, "Know your location. Return voluntarily or terms become public. Garrett P. arrives Cavalry Creek, January 31st. VH, January 31st was 11 days away. Elias read it twice. He set it down on his knee beside the title document and looked at the 2 pieces of paper, one the evidence of everything she owned, one the evidence of everything pursuing her. And he sat with that for a moment without speaking. When did you get this? He said. His voice was quiet. 2 days ago. You waited 2 days to tell me. I was trying to decide what it changed, she said, whether it changed things between us. Whether you would... She stopped. Whether I would what? He said. She looked at him directly. Whether you would want me to go, she said. Before the 31st? Before he arrives, and makes this your problem. Elias looked at the telegram again. Garrett P. arrives. Cavalry Creek, January 31st. He thought about a man named Garrett Phelps, who had sat in a dead man's chair. He thought about what it meant that Victor Hartwell had found her. Not guessed, not suspected, but found her, known her location specifically enough to send a telegram directly to the ranch. "How did he find you?" Elias said. Something shifted in her face. "I don't know. My solicitor was the only person who knew where I was going, unless—" She stopped. "Unless he's been compromised, or unless Victor has someone watching the agency in Denver." A pause, and her voice dropped slightly. "Or unless someone here made it easy." Elias was very still. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," she said again. "Maybe nothing. Maybe someone mentioned me in a letter. Maybe the wrong person overheard something in the feed store." She looked at her hands. "Victor has money, and Victor has patience. If he wanted to find me, he had options I couldn't have anticipated." Elias thought about the feed store. He thought about Dell, who was 18 and from Missouri and had no reason to know anything. He thought about Margaret, who was the most reliably closed-mouthed person in the county. He thought about Caleb Rourke, who had connections to buyers in Denver for his cattle and traveled through the city twice a year. He thought about Caleb asking, the day after Adeline arrived, whether she had come in on the Denver line. The particular interest in the detail. A man who thought he was gathering information without appearing to gather information. He did not say this yet. He kept it where it was and looked at Adeline. "You're not going anywhere before the 31st, he said. She looked up. "Elias, you're not going," he said. "And this," he tapped the telegram, "is not going to run you off your own ground." "It's your ground," she said. "You said it yourself," he said. "It's where you live." She was quiet. He could see her processing it, working through it the way she worked through everything, methodically, without illusion, accounting for what was real rather than what she wanted. "Garrett Phelps arriving in Cavalry Creek is not a social call," she said. "Victor doesn't send people for social calls. He will come to this ranch." "Let him come," Elias said. "He'll have legal instruments. He may have a territorial marshal if Victor has managed to get someone to sign off on it. He will say I am mentally unfit. He will say the documents are forgeries. He will say, Adeline." He said her name and she stopped. "Is the title document in your father's handwriting?" "Yes." "Notarized." "Is the will witnessed?" 3 witnesses, all still living." "Is there a bank in Chicago that can verify the gold certificates?" "Yes. The First Continental on Adams Street. My father's bank for 30 years. He nodded. "Then what Phelps brings with him is paper," he said. "Paper against paper. And in a territorial court, the original carries more weight than the revision." He paused. "You need a lawyer." "I can't go to Chicago about—" "Not Chicago," he said. "Here. There's a man in Laramie, says Samuel Oak. He practiced in Boston for 12 years before he came west. He's not in Victor Hartwell's pocket because Victor Hartwell has never heard of him." He looked at her. "I'll send a telegram tomorrow." She stared at him. He could see her recalibrating, shifting the picture she had been carrying to accommodate something she had not factored into it. "Why?" she said slowly. "Do you know a lawyer in Laramie?" "Because I've needed one," he said. "More than once. Running a ranch means knowing which fights you can win in a field and which ones you can only win in a courtroom." He picked up the telegram and the title document and held them both out to her. "Put these back in the trunk, lock it, and then tell me everything else that's in there, because if we're going to build a case, I need to know what we have." She took the documents from him. Her hands were steady, but he noticed, the same way he had been noticing things for 7 weeks now, that she held on to them for just a second longer than necessary, as if making sure they were real. "We," she said. Not a question, testing it the same way she'd tested his name that first night. "We," he said. She put the documents back in the trunk. She locked it. She sat back down across from him, and for the next 2 hours she told him everything, methodically, completely, without softening the parts that were difficult or the parts that made her look less composed than she wanted to. She told him about her father and what he had built and why he had left it to her and what Victor had done with the 3 weeks after the funeral. She told him about the solicitor, a small, precise man named Aldous Fenn, who had been with her father since the beginning and who had said, when she came to him in the night with her plan, not "this is too dangerous, but we'll need to be very careful about the sequence." She told him about Garrett Phelps, who was not cruel in the way Victor was cruel, not a man who slammed documents onto tables, but who was the kind of man who simply did what Victor required of him, which was, she said quietly, almost worse. She told him about leaving, about packing the trunk over 4 nights while Victor's men watched the house, carrying items out in increments small enough not to register as preparation. About the morning she walked out the front door with her hat on and her gloves on and the appearance of a woman going to a dressmaker's appointment, and did not come back. "Were you afraid?" Elias asked. She thought about it. "I was afraid before I left," she said. "Once I was moving, I wasn't." A pause. Being afraid and moving anyway is not the same as not being afraid. He looked at her. He thought about a man riding into a blizzard for cattle he could not afford to lose and might not be able to save. He thought about the particular arithmetic of a person who has decided that what is on the other side of the dangerous thing is worth more than the safety of standing still. "No," he said, "it's not." It was past 3 in the afternoon when she finished. The light through the window had gone the low amber color of a Wyoming winter afternoon, which meant an hour to dark, maybe less. Elias needed to be in the barn before dark. He stood and stretched, and his shoulder reminded him firmly that it was still in the complaint phase of its recovery. He was at the door when she said, "What made you stay after you read the telegram? Most men haven't watched you tie a bowline in a blizzard," he said, without turning around. A silence. "That's not a sufficient reason," she said. He turned. She was looking at him with the direct, assessing look that he had gotten used to, the one that meant she was taking a real measurement and intended to use the result. "No," he said. "It's not the only one." He paused, and then he said the thing he had been not saying for some time, the thing that had been sitting at the edge of his thoughts since the night she had repaired Lottie's doll with thread too fine to see. "You came here needing somewhere to be," he said. "That's what you said. You needed somewhere no one would look, but you didn't treat this place like a hiding spot. You treated it like something worth protecting." He stopped. "That means something to me, this place." He did not say, and everyone in it, because he was not certain he could say that without his voice doing something he did not want it to do. "It means something." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face did the thing it had almost done several times before, came close to the edge of the composure and then held, but differently this time. Not through effort, through something more like the expression of a person who has stopped needing to hold quite so hard. "I'll have dinner started before you're done in the barn," she said. "Beans are in the left cupboard," he said. "I know where the beans are," she said, and there was something in it that was almost warm, almost light, the closest thing to ease he had heard from her in 7 weeks. He went to the barn. He fed the horses and checked the cattle and stood in the cold air for a moment looking at the horizon, at the mountains in the west going dark against a sky that was going the deep blue of a Wyoming dusk. And he thought about a man named Garrett Phelps, who would arrive at Cavalry Creek Station in 11 days, with papers from a compromised court and instructions from a man who had sat in a dead man's chair. He thought about Samuel Oak in Laramie, who was precise and careful and had never, to Elias's knowledge, lost a case he believed in. He thought about what it meant to fight for something. Not the way you fought weather or cattle or bad seasons. Not the endurance kind of fighting, the keep moving, don't stop, outlast it kind. The other kind. The kind where you stood in a room and said, "This is mine," and made it stick. He had not done that kind in a long time. He had not had occasion to. He went back inside. The kitchen smelled like something better than beans. Adeline had found the salt pork in the back of the larder, and there was cornbread in the pan. Real cornbread this time, not the architectural material he used to produce. And Lottie was back from Margaret's and sitting at the table telling Adeline at significant length about a crow Margaret kept that had learned to say one word, which was no, and which said it apparently at every conceivable opportunity. "He said it when she tried to feed him," Lottie reported, "and when she tried to move his cage, and when she tried to put the cover on. He just says no over and over." "He sounds like he has very clear opinions," Adeline said, stirring something. Margaret says he's the most honest creature she's ever met, Lottie said, because he means it every time. Adeline laughed. An actual laugh, not the careful, near smile she generally permitted herself, a real one, short and unguarded. And it changed her face completely, made her look younger and less careful and entirely present in a way she usually wasn't quite. Lottie looked enormously pleased with herself. Elias hung up his coat and washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table, and Lottie immediately migrated to the topic of whether crows were smarter than horses, which she had strong opinions about, and dinner was served with the particular noise and motion of an evening that had somehow, without anyone deciding it should, become normal. Later, when Lottie was in bed and the dishes were done and the fire was banked and the telegram was locked in the iron-bound trunk with the title documents and the gold certificates and the bearer bonds and the thread from Adeline's mother, Elias sat at the table with a piece of paper and wrote out the telegram he intended to send to Samuel Oak in Laramie in the morning. He wrote it carefully. He described the situation with the precision of a man who had learned over 15 years that clarity, on the frontier and in courts and in all things that mattered, was worth more than eloquence. When he was done, he looked at it. Then he looked at the door to the small bedroom beside Lottie's, where the lamp had gone out an hour ago, where the woman who had come to his ranch running from a powerful man with fabricated papers was either sleeping or lying awake working the problem the way she worked all problems, methodically, without stopping, until she found the shape of the answer. He thought, Victor Hartwell has never had to fight on ground that wasn't his. He folded the telegram draft and put it in his coat pocket. He thought, he's never had to come to Wyoming. He blew out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in 11 days his shoulder let him sleep through to morning, which he took as something, though he could not have said precisely what. Samuel Oak arrived from Laramie on the 28th of January, 3 days before Garrett Phelps was due at Cavalry Creek Station. He was not what Elias had expected, which seemed to be a recurring theme that winter. Oak was 63 years old, slight, with the kind of thinning white hair that made him look like someone's grandfather until you watched him read a document, at which point something in his face sharpened into a precision that had nothing grandfatherly about it. He had traveled through 2 days of hard cold without complaint and arrived at the ranch in a hired buggy with a leather satchel that he held on his lap the entire drive, as if it contained something that would not survive being set down carelessly. He sat at Elias's kitchen table, and he read every document Adeline placed before him. He read them in order, without rushing, asking questions that were specific and quiet and occasionally so pointed that Adeline had to stop and think before answering. He asked about dates. He asked about the notary who had witnessed her father's will. He asked about the chain of custody on the title documents, and whether Aldous Fenn, the solicitor in Chicago, had kept copies of everything. He kept copies, Adeline said, filed with the Cook County recorder before I left. Oak looked up. He filed them before Victor could move to seal the probate record? 3 days before. Oak was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your Mr. Fenn is either very brave or very intelligent. Both, Adeline said. He worked for my father for 20 years. He understood exactly what he was doing. Oak set down the document he was holding and folded his hands on the table. Miss Hartwell, he said, what Victor Hartwell has done is not unusual. Men of his type operate with the assumption that legal machinery is a tool available to whoever can afford to operate it, and that assumption is frequently correct. He paused. What is unusual is that you left with the original instruments intact, with a concurrent filing in Cook County, and with a solicitor still in Chicago willing to testify to the legitimacy of your father's intent. He looked at her steadily. That is not a weak position. That is actually a considerably strong position, if we can keep it from being argued in a venue of Victor's choosing. Can we? Elias said. The territorial court in Laramie has no reason to defer to a Cook County probate proceeding, Oak said, and a territorial court in Laramie has every reason to look poorly on a man who sends a representative to another state to compel a woman to return to a legal situation she has legitimately contested. He tapped the telegram, Victor's telegram, which Adeline had given him early in the review. This is coercive correspondence. In a less favorable environment, it would be dismissed. Here, it is evidence of intent. Phelps arrives in 3 days, Elias said. Good. Oak said with the calm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this kind of problem for a long time. I'd like to be there when he does. The next 2 days were preparation, and preparation was not dramatic. It was Oak at the table with his papers. It was Adeline going through the trunk a final time, organizing documents into an order that Oak specified, each one catalogued and cross-referenced in his careful small handwriting. It was Elias sending a second telegram to Aldous Fenn in Chicago, whose address Adeline provided from memory, requesting written confirmation of the Cook County filing and the original date of execution of Edward Hartwell's will. Fenn's response arrived in under 18 hours, which told Elias something about the kind of man Fenn was and how long he had been waiting for someone to ask. It was Lottie, on the evening of the 30th, who asked the question that none of the adults had addressed directly. She was at the table doing her figures. She was working on long division, which she found irritating and said so regularly. And she set down her pencil and looked at Adeline with the directness that had been her defining characteristic since birth. "Is that man coming to take you away?" she said. The room went quiet. Oak, in the corner with his papers, did not look up, but his pen stopped moving. Adeline looked at Lottie without flinching. "A man is coming," she said. "He works for my uncle. He wants me to go back to Chicago." "Do you want to go?" "No," Adeline said simply. "Then why would you?" Lottie said with the logic of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that the world frequently overrode the obvious answer. Adeline looked at her for a moment. "Sometimes people try to make you do things you don't want to do," she said. "By using rules they've bent in their favor. That's what my uncle is trying to do." Lottie thought about this. "Can he?" "We're working on making sure he can't," Adeline said. Lottie looked at Oak's back, then at her father, then back at Adeline. "Okay," she said, and picked up her pencil and went back to her long division with the air of someone who has assessed a situation and determined that the competent people are on it. Elias caught Adeline's eye across the table. She looked like someone who had just been handed something she hadn't known she needed. Garrett Phelps arrived at Cavalry Creek Station on the morning of January 31st on the 9 o'clock train from Denver. Elias and Oak were there. Adeline was not, which had been Oak's specific instruction. Let them come to you, on your ground, not the other way around, and which had cost Adeline something to agree to because sitting still while something moved toward her ran against every instinct she had developed since February. Phelps was exactly what Adeline had described. He was 51, well-dressed for the weather, but not adequately, with the slightly pinched expression of a man who had been on a train for too long in conditions he found inappropriate. He had 2 men with him, a territorial marshal, as she had predicted, and a younger man who carried a leather portfolio and had the look of someone recently graduated from a law office in a city where things worked differently. The marshal's name was Burdett. He was a compact, weathered man who looked like he had ridden a lot of ground and formed a lot of opinions about the people he had ridden it for. He presented his commission to Elias on the platform with the practiced neutrality of someone who understood that his job was process, not judgment. "I have a writ of civil attachment," Burdett said, "issued from Cook County, directing the return of one Adeline M. Hartwell to the jurisdiction of the Illinois Probate Court." "You're a long way from Cook County," Oak said pleasantly, from beside Elias. Burdett looked at him. "And you are?" "Samuel Oak. I represent Miss Hartwell in the territory of Wyoming." Oak held out his hand, and after a moment Burdett shook it. "That writ is a civil instrument from an Illinois court. It has no compulsory authority in Wyoming territory without confirmation from the territorial court in Laramie, which has not been sought and has not been granted." He paused. "I have a letter from the Laramie court clerk to that effect, if you'd like to see it." Burdett looked at Phelps. Phelps looked at the young lawyer with the portfolio. The young lawyer opened the portfolio and said something in a low voice that Elias couldn't hear, and Phelps' expression went through several adjustments before settling on something that was trying to be confident. "We're not here to argue jurisdiction on a train platform," Phelps said. He looked at Elias with the assessing look of a man accustomed to determining which people in a room were obstacles. "You're Voss, the rancher." "I am," Elias said. "Miss Hartwell is staying at your property." "My wife is at home," Elias said. "Yes." The word landed. Phelps blinked. The young lawyer stopped shuffling papers. Even Burdett, who had been maintaining his professional neutrality with some dedication, looked up. "Your wife," Phelps repeated. "We were married on the 29th, Oak said, which was true, because Elias had asked Adeline on the 27th in the kitchen with no particular ceremony, and she had looked at him for a long moment and said, "That's either the most practical thing you've ever done, or the bravest." And he had said probably both, and she had said yes. And the following day, Oak had performed the civil ceremony with Margaret and Dell as witnesses, and Lottie standing on her tiptoes to see better, and Margaret crying in the efficient, no-nonsense way Margaret did everything. "A Wyoming marriage," Oak continued, "makes Miss Hartwell a Wyoming resident by domicile, which means any proceeding related to her person or her property falls under the jurisdiction of the territorial court, not Cook County probate." He tilted his head slightly. "You're welcome to test that argument in Laramie, of course. I'd enjoy the opportunity." Phelps looked at Elias with the specific expression of a man recalibrating. "Victor will not accept this," he said. "Victor," Elias said, "is not here." He said it without heat, flatly, as a statement of geography. "You are. And what you have is a civil writ that doesn't operate in this territory, and a marshal who I suspect has enough experience to know when he's been brought somewhere on paper that doesn't hold." He looked at Burdett. "Marshal." Burdett looked at the writ in his hand. He looked at Oak's letter from the Laramie court. He was quiet for a moment, with the expression of a man doing an honest arithmetic. "Mr. Phelps," Burdett said, "the gentleman is correct that this writ requires territorial confirmation I don't have. I can accompany you to Laramie to seek it, but I cannot compel anyone to come with me on the basis of what I'm currently holding." He folded the writ. "That's not an opinion. That's the law." Phelps looked like he was chewing something that had gone bad. He looked at Elias. He looked at Oak. He looked at the platform, at Cavalry Creek, at the mountains behind it, at the particular quality of the cold, and Elias could see him arriving at the understanding that he was in a place that did not operate the way Chicago operated, and that the tools Victor had given him were built for a different kind of terrain. "Victor will pursue this," Phelps said. His voice had lost something, the certainty, mostly. "He's welcome to pursue it in Laramie," Oak said. "With the original will, the notarized title instruments, the Cook County filing, and a territorial court that has no relationship with the Cook County bench." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment for a long time and intended to enjoy it without being obvious about it. "Tell him we look forward to the conversation." Phelps left on the afternoon train. Burdett tipped his hat to Elias before he boarded, which Elias took as a kind of honest acknowledgement that had nothing to do with whose side anyone was on. Elias and Oki drove back to the ranch in the hired buggy through the cold afternoon, and Elias did not say much, and Oak seemed to understand that and did not fill the silence unnecessarily. The mountains were clear to the west, the sky above them the particular deep blue that Wyoming produced in late January, and the road was frozen but passable, and the horse knew the way. "He'll try again," Elias said, somewhere past the halfway mark. "He will," Oak agreed. "Victor Hartwell is not a man who accepts the first no, but each subsequent attempt will be in a jurisdiction we've already established. The Cook County challenge Fenn filed will come to hearing in the spring. I've been in correspondence with a colleague in Chicago who is willing to argue it. The fabricated instruments Victor produced will not survive a direct comparison with your wife's documents." He paused. "This is not over. But the shape of it has changed. He was trying to take something from someone alone. That's a different fight than taking something from someone who is not alone." Elias looked at the road ahead. How different. Oak was quiet for a moment. "Considerably," he said. Adeline was in the yard when they came up the drive, which meant she had been watching for them. She had her coat on and her arms crossed against the cold, and she read Elias's face before he had stopped the buggy, the way she had been reading him since December, with the particular attention of a woman who had learned what his expressions meant and used that knowledge without apology. He set the brake and looked at her. "He's on the afternoon train back to Denver," he said. She let out a breath. It was the only place where the composure broke, just that one controlled exhale, and then she pressed her lips together and nodded. "Oak?" she said. Exactly what you needed, Elias said. He wants to be in Laramie when Victor tries again. She looked at Oak, who had climbed down from the buggy with his satchel and was brushing road dust from his coat. Thank you, she said. She said it plainly, without ornamentation. Thank your husband, Oak said. He wrote me a very clear telegram. He went inside because the cold was what it was and left them in the yard. Adeline looked at Elias. He climbed down from the buggy. They were standing in the yard of the ranch, in the cold, in the late afternoon light that was already going the amber color of a Wyoming winter dusk, and there was nothing dramatic about the moment. The buggy horse was blowing steam, there was manure from the morning somewhere nearby, the barn needed the east door rehung because the hinge had been loose since October. How did he take it? She said. Phelps. Like a man who is sent to do something with the wrong tools, Elias said. He'll report back to Victor. Victor will try something else. But it'll take time, and we've got the ground now. She nodded slowly. She looked at the house. Her house. The house where she had learned the stove damper and the fence repair and the bowline knot and the particular way the light came through the east window in the morning at this latitude and this season. Her house, where a 6-year-old girl's doll sat on a shelf with an arm reattached by thread too fine to see. I spent 8 months planning how to run, she said quietly. I spent almost no time planning what to run to. And? Elias said. She looked at him. I didn't plan well enough, she said. What I ran to was better than what I planned. He was not a man given to large expressions of anything. He was a man who fixed fence posts and read ledgers by lamplight, and had taught himself to braid hair on a fence post with strips of leather, and the things that mattered most to him he generally expressed by continuing to show up for them rather than by talking about them at length. So he did not say anything eloquent. He put his arm around her shoulders, carefully, because the left one was still occasionally the subject of complaint, and she did not step away, and they stood in the yard for a moment in the cold looking at nothing in particular. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, late, grudging, and then all at once, as if the land had been holding its breath for months and finally let go. The snow came off the mountains in a long, slow melt that turned the lower pasture into something that was technically mud, but felt more personal than that, and the fence lines that had been buried since December emerged inch by inch, like things being slowly returned. Elias rebuilt the south gate in March, properly this time, with new hardware and a bottom hinge he had ordered from the catalog in February. Dell helped and did not injure himself in any of the 3 ways Elias had anticipated, which represented genuine growth. Margaret came in April with seeds from her kitchen garden and an opinion about where they should be planted, and Adeline received both with the equanimity she brought to most of Margaret's offerings, which was to say, she implemented about 70% of the advice and executed the rest her own way, and the garden was the better for the combination. Oak wrote from Laramie in March that the Cook County Challenge had reached the hearing phase. He wrote in April that Aldous Fenn had testified for 3 hours about the original will and the circumstances of its execution, and that the fabricated instruments Victor had produced had not, as predicted, survived direct comparison. He wrote in May, a longer letter, arriving on a Wednesday, which Elias read at the kitchen table while Adeline stood at the window with her back to him, that the probate court had ruled in favor of the original will, that Victor Hartwell's authority over the Hartwell Continental Estate had been formally revoked, and that Adeline M. Hartwell Voss was recognized as the sole legitimate inheritor of her father's estate. She stood at the window for a long time after he told her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, "I don't know what to do with winning." "You've been doing it all winter," he said. "You just didn't know it was the same thing." She turned from the window and looked at him, and she did something she rarely did in front of him. She let her face do what it wanted for a moment, without management, and what it did was complicated and entirely human, and not something he could have put a name to if he tried, which he didn't, because some things were not improved by naming. Victor attempted 2 more challenges through the Illinois courts over the following 6 months. Oak and Fenn handled them, and the second one was dismissed before it reached hearing. By August, even Victor's lawyers seemed to be arriving at the conclusion that the ground had shifted in a direction that was not going to shift back. Elias did not hear what happened to Victor Hartwell after that. He did not ask. Some men's ends were their own business, and knowing the details would not have changed anything that mattered on a ranch in Wyoming in the year 1894. What changed on the ranch was more specific and more real than a legal outcome in a city 800 miles away. The east pasture fence was replaced entirely, with proper posts sunk below the frost line, which meant it would hold through winters that the old fence would not have. The cattle herd grew to 47 head by autumn, which was the largest it had been since the year before Clara died. The bunkhouse got a new roof, Dell's project mostly, with oversight from Elias, and Dell managed it without structural incident, which was the occasion of a quiet pride on both sides. The kitchen had a different stove by October. The old one had been a point of mutual grievance since December, and Adeline had researched replacements with the thoroughness she brought to all problems, and had identified a model from a manufacturer in St. Louis that vented correctly regardless of temperature, and it arrived by freight wagon in early September, and Elias installed it over a long afternoon with a great deal of effort and several opinions he kept to himself. And when he finally got the flue right and the fire going cleanly, Adeline stood at it for a moment and then looked at him. "No smoke," she said. "No smoke," he agreed. "I want you to know," she said, "that I have complicated feelings about this because hating that stove was one of the first things we had in common." He looked at her. "We had more than that," he said. "Yes," she said, "but the stove was early." He almost smiled. She noticed, because she always noticed. Lottie turned 7 in September and was given, after extended negotiation, a dog of uncertain parentage from a litter at the Aldrin farm. She named it Compass because it always seemed to know which direction she was going and went there first. The dog was not well behaved by any objective measure, but it was loyal in the absolute, uncomplicated way that only certain dogs and certain people managed, and it followed Lottie everywhere she went with a devotion that was almost embarrassing to witness. On a Tuesday evening in late October, Lottie was at the table doing her reading. She had moved past the primer and was working through a collection of stories that Margaret had contributed from her own shelves. And Adeline was mending something at the other end of the table, and Elias was going over the fall ledger, which for the first time in 3 years was not making him tired in the particular way that bad numbers made him tired. Lottie looked up from her book and looked at Adeline. She had been looking at Adeline with an expression that had been building for some time, the way her expressions always built, slowly, thoroughly, without announcement. "Mama?" Lottie said. It was the first time she had said it. Not Adeline. Not the careful, testing distance of a child who was not yet sure. Just, "Mama." The word she had been carrying since September and had not yet put down anywhere. Adeline went very still. Lottie looked back at her book, as if she had said something unremarkable, as if it had simply been the correct word for the thing she meant, which it was. Elias looked at Adeline from across the table. Her head was bent over her mending. Her shoulders were doing something he recognized, the particular set of a person who is holding themselves together through a moment that is too large for the room, too large for the ordinary Tuesday evening around them, too large to be addressed directly without breaking it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way he had the night after the blizzard, in the cold kitchen, with nothing to say and no need to say it. She turned her hand under his and held on. Lottie read her story. Compass twitched in his sleep by the stove. The fire burned correctly. It always burned correctly now. And the lamplight was steady, and outside the Wyoming night was cold and clear and entirely itself, indifferent and enormous, and threaded through with stars that had been there long before any of them arrived and would be there long after, which was either a humbling thing or a comforting one, depending on how you held it. Elias had started holding it as a comfort. He wasn't sure when that had changed. Sometime between December and now. Sometime in the months when the ranch had stopped feeling like a thing he was managing alone, and had started feeling like a thing being held up from more than one side. The iron-bound trunk was in the corner of the bedroom now, unlocked. It had been unlocked since May. What it contained was no longer a secret and no longer a weapon and no longer a survival kit for a woman running from a man who wanted to own what she had inherited. It contained documents and certificates and her mother's thread and 2 photographs of her father that she had looked at once with Elias, briefly, without explanation, before closing the trunk and going to start dinner. It was a box. It had been always just a box. The contents were the thing, and the contents were hers, and no one was coming to take them, and she knew where they were, and that was enough. The real things she had brought to Wyoming were not in any trunk. They were in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, 3/4 on the damper. They were in the south gate, repaired and holding. They were in the dog that followed Lottie everywhere, and the garden that was 2/3 Margaret's advice. They were in the slow, unsentimental process by which 2 people who had both been cracked in different places figured out how to stand in the same space without requiring each other to be something they were not. That was the thing no one told you about starting over, Elias had come to understand. It was not a dramatic event. It was a sequence of ordinary mornings that accumulated into something you recognized, one day, as a life. Not the life you had planned, not the life that had been interrupted. Something different. Something that had its own weight and its own specific gravity and its own reasons for being worth protecting. He had needed someone strong, he had written in the advertisement. The land required it. Lottie required it. The agency had sent him Adeline Hartwell. He had not known, writing that letter, that strength came in more forms than he had thought to ask for. He had been thinking of physical endurance, of willingness to work, of frontier durability. Those things were real, and she had all of them. But the strength that had mattered, the strength that had rebuilt something in this house that he had not known could be rebuilt, was the kind that walks out into a blizzard with a rope and a lantern because it will not accept losing what it has found. The kind that repairs a child's doll with thread too fine to see. The kind that tells the truth in pieces, as fast as it can be safely told, to a man it is still in the process of trusting. That kind of strength was harder to name and harder to find and worth considerably more. Outside, the wind moved across the flats. The mountains stood against the dark sky the way they always stood, without asking anything of anyone, without offering anything that wasn't already there to take. The house held. It always held. And inside it, 3 people and 1 disreputable dog sat in the lamplight on a Tuesday evening in October, and were, without ceremony, without drama, without any particular awareness that this was the thing they had been working toward all winter, home.